Giovanni de' Medici was not a man of noble birth. In fact, he came from the slums of Florence, rising from rural poverty through aggressive salesmanship and financial caution. Running his bank from the back of a wool shop, Giovanni de' Medici had grown a successful business in a society where powerful families fought each other for political control. At the same time, former pirate and long-term client of Giovanni's, named Balthasar Cosa, embarked on an alternative career in the church. All he needed were campaign funds. Giovanni de' Medici knew of the chaos in the church and realized that with proper financial backing, even Cosa stood a chance of becoming pope. Giovanni took a gamble by providing enormous funds to support Cosa's campaign. The Medicis supported Cosa from priest to cardinal, and finally to the papacy. In 1410, Balthasar Cosa was elected Pope John XXIII. Cosa did not forget his friends, the Medicis. The Medicis became the God's bankers, bankers to the Vatican. With this sudden leap in social status, the Medicis joined an elite group of Florentines. Cosimo de' Medici, the son of Giovanni de' Medici, inherited his family's commercial and financial practices after the death of his father in 1429. He also kept up his family's tradition of defending the poor against the wealthy, earning him both popularity and the jealousy of famous oligarchs. As the first of the Medici political dynasty, Cosimo was an avid scholar, seeking knowledge at the dawn of the 15th century. He added to a growing library of manuscripts and ancient learning, a collection that was open to the public and inspired Cosimo to found the Platonic Academy. Cosimo's generosity was enjoyed not only by scholars, but also by some of Florence's greatest sculptors and painters of the 14th century. Among them, the sculptors Lorenzo Ghiberti and Donatello, and the painters Andrea del Castagno, Filippo Lippi, and Benzzotto Cozzoli. Cosimo granted these artists commissions and treated them as friends, despite the elite's harsh attitude towards manual workers. Another friend of Cosimo's, Filippo Brunelleschi, was a mad architect and self-taught genius. Skilled in drawing and painting, wood carving, sculpture, stone setting, niello, enamel work, and was an apprentice to a goldsmith. His wild temper did not stop the Medicis from recognizing his talent, and the family became patrons of the architect. The family commissioned the construction of a state orphanage that would become a showcase for Brunelleschi's ideas and the Medici's ambition.
Brunelleschi used classical orders of architecture that had not been used in over 1,000 years. Now, with these new buildings, an architectural revolution began. Enormous Roman capitals and pillars, monumental windows, and carved stones appeared, making this the first time the columns were used for structural support since the days of ancient Rome.
Brunelleschi was not satisfied. With the backing of the Medicis, Brunelleschi set his eyes on the Cathedral Santa Maria del Fiore, the greatest challenge in Florence. The Santa Maria del Fiore stood unfinished for over 100 years, a project originally begun by the church in 1296. The original plans were overly ambitious, intending to build the largest dome in the world, but ultimately leaving an enormous hole in the roof of their cathedral. It was later decided that the structure's crowning glory would be the largest cupola on earth. Whilst no one had ever made a self-supporting dome before, Brunelleschi, obsessed with the mysteries of the ancient world, was confident that he could solve the problem.
Brunelleschi had no formal training, and the ideas he brought to the building sites were completely new. Knowing that there wasn't enough timber in Italy to build a scaffold inside the cathedral, Brunelleschi instead came up with plans for an inner hemispherical dome with a second brick dome placed on top, held together by 9 sandstone rings. To raise the bricks and sandstone, Brunelleschi also had to invent an efficient hoisting system with the world's first reverse gear.
With Cosimo's patronage, Brunelleschi was finally able to complete the Duomo in 1436, after 16 years of construction. The Duomo was Cosimo de' Medici's crowning achievement as a sponsor, and he invited the Pope himself to consecrate the finished cathedral on Easter Sunday, officiating the pride of Florence. Donato di Niccolò di Bettobardi, better known as Donatello, was a close friend of Brunelleschi's, accompanying him to Rome at one point, where he studied goldsmithing and developed an interest in manipulating metals.
Well known for having a violent temper, Donatello would rather destroy his own creations than sell them to an unappreciative client. This earned him many unhappy customers, but he was publicly defended by Cosimo I, the two having become close friends.
Donatello is most well known for his statue of David, commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici for the Palazzo Medici around 1440. David was typically portrayed as a king, but Donatello chose instead to depict him as a nude youth. This work was essentially the revival of nude sculpture, becoming the first large-scale, freestanding nude statue of the Renaissance, and the first such piece created in over 1,000 years.
Donatello maintained a lifelong friendship with the Medicis and, upon retirement, received an allowance that he could live on until his death in 1466.
With the passing of Cosimo I in 1464, his son, Lorenzo de' Medici, inherited both his father's fortune and the responsibility of becoming what was essentially a godfather to the citizens of Florence. He easily adapted to the role, encouraging artistic expression and secular freedom. In 1488, Lorenzo established history's first art school, providing classical sculptures from his own personal collection that could be studied. It was here in this school that Lorenzo encountered a 13-year-old boy who was copying a head of a faun in marble by the name of Michelangelo Buonarroti.
After complimenting him, Lorenzo joked that fawns were supposed to be old men, and old men rarely had all their teeth. The boy immediately knocked out one of the teeth and had Lorenzo take a second look.
Lorenzo took Michelangelo into his family, allowing him to live at the Palazzo Medici and grow up alongside Lorenzo's 7 children. In the relationship that formed between the young artist and his benefactor, education and exposure to new artistic and philosophical works heavily influenced Michelangelo's work at the time. Michelangelo grew to be a true workaholic who rarely slept. In 1501, he received a commission from the Opera del Duomo to carve a slab of marble that had been damaged by another sculptor 35 years prior. It was a project that left Michelangelo working tirelessly for 4 years. When he had finished, the statue of David stood over 14 feet tall, a monumental achievement that essentially became the symbol of Florence. Only 5 years older than Lorenzo de' Medici, an artist by the name of Alessandro Filippi became close friends with Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. Referred to as Botticelli, his name comes from the nickname of his elder brother Giovanni, a large-bellied pawnbroker who was called Il Bottici, the barrel. Giovanni was close with his younger brother and always had Sandro by his side. Giovanni's friends began calling Sandro Botticelli, the Little Barrel. Botticelli was apprenticed to a goldsmith. Later, he became a pupil of the painter Fra Filippo Lippi. And, by the late 1460s, Botticelli had made a name for himself, becoming a protégé of several members of the powerful Medici family. Intimacy with the most powerful family in Florence was critical to Botticelli's career. Inspired by philosophical debates and classical legends discussed among Lorenzo's intellectual friends, and under the protection of the Medici, Botticelli created an entirely new genre of art. His work, La Primevera, was neither portrait, icon, nor holy celebration. It was pure fantasy, inspired by poetry and fueled by vivid imagination.
Of August, gold-wreathed and beautiful, Aphrodite I shall sing, to whose domain belong the battlements of all sea loved Cyprus, where blown by the moist breath of Zephyros, she was carried over the waves of the resounding sea on soft foam. Her gold-filleted Ori happily welcomed her and clothed her with heavenly raiment.
The theme of the birth of Venus, one of Botticelli's most famous works, could have been taken from the writings of the ancient poet Homer. The theme comes in part from Ovid's Metamorphoses, a very important work in Latin literature. According to the traditional account, after Venus was born, she rode on a seashell and sea foam to the island of Cythera. Venus is prominently depicted in the center, borne out of the foam as she rides to the shore. On the left, the figure of Zephyrus carries the nymph Chloris, alternatively identified as Aura, as he blows the wind to guide Venus. On shore, a figure who has been identified as Pomona, or as the goddess of spring, waits for Venus with mantle in hand. The mantle billows in the wind from Zephyrus's mouth. More likely still, the painting was inspired by stanzas, a famous poetic work by Agnello Poliziano, a contemporary of Botticelli, and the greatest Neoplatonic poet of the Medici court. Neoplatonism was a current of thought that tried to connect the Greek and Roman cultural heritage with Christianity. The Neoplatonic philosophical meaning is then clear. The work would mean the birth of love and the spiritual beauty as a driving force of life. The Birth of Venus is the first example in Tuscany of a painting on canvas. During this time, wood panels were popular surfaces for painting, and would remain popular through the end of the 16th century. Canvas, however, was starting to gain acceptance by painters. It worked well in humid regions, such as Venice, because wooden panels tended to become warped in such climates. Canvas also cost less than wood, but it was also considered to be less formal, which made it more appropriate for paintings that would be shown in non-official locations. Botticelli's special use of expensive alabaster powder, making the colours even brighter and timeless, is another characteristic that makes the Birth of Venus unique.
Botticelli had successfully developed his own form of visual poetry, peppered with symbolism and private jokes, making him the most radical artist at the time.
Lorenzo often commissioned works from the studio of a wealthy craftsman, Verrocchio. Verrocchio left everyday jobs to a group of young apprentices. One in particular was producing extraordinary work. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. Born on April 15, 1452, in Vinci near Florence, Leonardo was an illegitimate son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a prominent notary. In 1466, at the age of 14, Leonardo became an apprentice to one of the leading artists in Florence, Andrea di Cione, known as Verrocchio.
He realized Leonardo's enormous talent. Verrocchio vowed to never paint again, and from then on continued only as a sculptor. Leonardo's artistic style was greatly influenced by Verrocchio, an exceptional artist and a sculptor who paid special attention to the execution of the vitality of the human figure.
After completing his apprenticeship, Leonardo continued working as Verrocchio's assistant. Earlier Renaissance artists had relied on the rules of linear perspective. Leonardo incorporated this principle and two others: perspective of clarity, where distant objects are less clear, and perspective of color, where distant objects are more muted in color. Da Vinci considered his eyes to be his main source for knowledge, believing that sight was a man's most important sense because it conveyed the facts of life instantly and accurately.
Da Vinci's most famous painting, the Mona Lisa, is thought to be a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of one of Leonardo's clients. This work is one of the first Italian portraits to focus so closely on the sitter in a half-length portrait. Da Vinci incorporated the equilibrium of the piece and how the atmosphere affects its perspective. None of his previous works portrayed such majesty as did the Mona Lisa.
Da Vinci, an inventor, painter, sculptor, architect, scientist, mathematician, and engineer, was the true definition of a Renaissance man, the foremost artist of all time.
The freedoms Lorenzo had brought upon Florence would soon be threatened by a Dominican monk named Savinarola. Traveling to Florence in 1486, Savinarola believed that Lorenzo de' Medici was leading the city to its destruction, and he damned any form of secular visual art, linking it directly to sin. By the late 1490s, he found a sort of following to whom he could preach, claiming that he could see the downfall of Florence in the future, caused by the decadence of Lorenzo's reign. While Florence had reached the peak of its culture, people began to believe that Savinarola was right and that the city was no longer on track. Lorenzo de' Medici fell seriously ill in 1492, leading to the belief that Savinarola's predictions were coming true. Seeking redemption for his sins, Lorenzo called Savinarola to his deathbed, but the monk damned him. Lorenzo died at the age of 43, fearing hell until his very last breath. In 1497, Savinarola spurred Christians in Florence to erect a 7-story pyre to burn art, books, mirrors, and jewelry that were believed to promote sin. Among those who participated was Botticelli, fearing for his own everlasting salvation and casting his works into the flames. The event came to be known as the Bonfire of the Vanities, engulfing what could have been some of the Renaissance's greatest masterpieces.
For 3 generations, the city of Florence had owed its cultural identity to the Medici patronage. Turning private money to public good and using it for the embellishment of the country helped the Medici family to achieve its status in the early part of the 15th century. Cosimo de' Medici pioneered the tradition of visible spending that would affect the welfare of the city. The Medici's power and desire were the catalysts for the new form of artistic expression. Art had been liberated. The Medici legacy reaches into the modern world. They transformed art and changed the course of civilization.